Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely massive shift in global business. For decades, carbon emissions were mostly just an abstract PR problem, right? Maybe a metric buried way in the back of an annual report. Well, that era is completely over. Today, carbon emissions are transforming into a hard, bottom-line metric for global trade. We are literally moving from a world where carbon was an afterthought into one where it directly dictates corporate survival. So let's look at exactly how and why this is happening. All right, let's dive right in. We're going to break this paradigm shift down into 4 quick parts. First, the global carbon loophole. Then, we'll get into decoding the CBAM. Third, the carbon competitive shift. And finally, how to actually go about winning the green economy. Okay, part 1, the global carbon loophole. This is really about exposing a fundamental flaw in global trade. To really get why these new rules are happening, you kind of have to understand the historical flaw that forced governments' hands in the first place. For years, you had regions with strict domestic rules telling their local factories, hey, you need to clean up and pay for your pollution. But instead of actually cleaning up, a lot of companies just packed their bags. They moved production out to countries with zero environmental rules. They literally offshored their emissions. It's a phenomenon known as carbon leakage. It's basically like squeezing a balloon, right? You push the air out of one side and it just bulges out on the other. Global climate goals were getting completely undermined because the carbon wasn't disappearing at all. It was just getting a different passport.
So the crucial point here is that carbon leakage wasn't just an environmental headache, it was a massive economic loophole. It punished the companies that were actually playing by the rules and rewarded the ones that fled. Regulators eventually woke up and realized you can't just regulate your own backyard if your front door is wide open to cheap carbon-heavy imports. This whole adapt or die reality is exactly what set the stage for our massive disruptor.
Which brings us to part 2. Decoding the CBAM. We're moving from macro policy into direct action.
So, what's the specific solution they rolled out to fix this massive loophole? Well, it is definitely not some minor tax tweak. It is literally designed to change global enterprise forever. CBAM, which stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I know, it sounds incredibly bureaucratic, but the core concept is actually brilliantly simple. Just think of it as a carbon toll booth right at the border. It's a regulatory tool that slaps a fair price on the carbon emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods entering the market. So, if you manufacture steel in a highly polluting factory overseas and try to import it, bam, you get hit with a tariff at the border that equals the domestic carbon price. It essentially levels the playing field overnight.
And it's pretty obvious who's standing in the crosshairs first. We're not talking about consumer electronics or software just yet. The CBAM targets the absolute foundational building blocks of modern civilization. We're talking heavy industries like steel, cement, and fertilizers. Just to give you an idea of the sheer scale here, if the global cement industry were a country, it would be the 3rd largest carbon emitter in the entire world. So by targeting these heavy materials right out of the gate, the regulation fundamentally changes the cost structure of literally everything downstream. Think about it. If steel and cement cost way more because of their carbon footprint, then the cost of building a skyscraper, manufacturing a car, or even growing crops with fertilizers, the whole shebang completely shifts.
Now, this regulation doesn't just hit all at once. It's a structured rollout, kind of designed to turn up the heat gradually. Phase 1 was just the policy introduction, getting the rules on the books. Then we have Phase 2, and this is where the real work begins for a lot of companies. This is the initial reporting phase. Importers basically just have to calculate and report their emissions. No money is changing hands just yet, but the data is being actively collected. And then we hit Phase 3, full financial implementation. The trial run is over, the toll booth barrier drops, and real money, we're talking potentially billions of dollars, starts being collected at the border based purely on how much carbon is baked into your product.
All right, on to part 3, the carbon competitive shift. Let's look at what actually happens when carbon equals cost. This is where we step out of the dry policy stuff and get into some really urgent business strategy. For 50 years, global trade was basically just a race to the bottom on price. You found the absolute cheapest place on Earth to manufacture a widget and you shipped it. But now, we are entering the era of competing on carbon efficiency. Let's say Factory A makes a widget for $10, but it pollutes like it's $18.99. Meanwhile, Factory B makes the exact same widget for $12, but they use clean energy. Under the old rules, Factory A wins, they pop the champagne. But under CBAM, that $10 widget from Factory A might get hit with the $4 carbon tariff at the border, bringing its true cost up to $14. Suddenly, that clean $12 widget from Factory B is actually the cheapest option on the market. That is a total game changer.
Which brings us to this defining realization.
The rise of the carbon competitive enterprise means emissions are now a hard bottom-line metric for corporate competitiveness. Seriously, let that sink in for a second. Mere compliance, just filling out the paperwork to keep the government off your back, that is no longer enough. Carbon efficiency has become a core competitive advantage. If your supply chain is cleaner than your rivals, you literally have better profit margins and a lower market price. Going green is no longer just a nice-to-have for the Earth. It is a highly aggressive business strategy. Consider the sheer financial stakes involved here. We are talking about tens of billions of dollars in trade value shifting hands. This isn't just some small rounding error on a balance sheet. For these heavy industries, the cost of carbon can represent a double-digit percentage of their total production cost. I really want every single business leader and supply chain manager watching this explainer right now to internalize what this reality represents, because it represents the potential loss of your entire market share if you're slow to act, but also an absolutely incredible opportunity if you're the first to adapt.
And that leads us perfectly into part 4, winning the green economy. How to actually survive and thrive under CBAM.
So how do modern companies actually pull this off in this totally new market? Well, we know the loophole, we know the mechanism, and we understand the competitive shift. The companies that are going to absolutely dominate the next decade share a few very specific traits. First off, they track their supply chain emissions closely. They aren't just guessing, they have exact hard data on every single vendor and every piece of raw material. Second, they invest heavily in green tech. And I don't mean for the PR optics. They do it to actively lower their production costs under this new CBAM framework. And third, they pivot from mere compliance to active strategy. They aren't sitting around asking, how do we pay this new tax? Instead, they're asking, how do we use our super low carbon footprint as a weapon to undercut our dirtier competitors?
If you want to build this into your own everyday business operations, you really need a high-stakes playbook. So here is the clear, strategic roadmap you need to follow. Step 1. Measure your carbon footprint rigorously. You simply cannot manage what you do not measure, right? You need granular visibility and you need it right now. Step 2. Optimize the supply chain. Look closely at your vendors. Can you switch to a supplier closer to home? Can you mandate that your existing suppliers use renewable energy? And Step 3. Compete globally on efficiency. Take that newly optimized low-carbon product and market it aggressively in regions where CBAM is actively driving up the prices of your competitors.
We've seen exactly how a regulatory fix to a global loophole is permanently rewiring the economics of heavy industry and international trade. So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. As carbon efficiency rapidly replaces raw price as the deciding factor in global trade, is your enterprise actually ready to compete? Or will you find yourself entirely priced out by the CBAM? The clock on the reporting phase is already ticking, folks. It's time to figure out exactly where you stand. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you next time.